The 80s was a landmark decade for the horror genre, with franchises such as Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street, and the Poltergeist series all making their spine-chilling bows into cinemas worldwide. Additionally, the slasher subgenre was at its peak following its mainstream emergence in the 70s, and the blend of horror with other genres, such as science fiction, led to greats such as The Thing and The Fly. Furthermore, advances in filmmaking technology, specifically gore-orientated practical effects and makeup and prosthetics, finally got to a point where these ghoulish characters and events could be convincingly portrayed given the limitations of the era. While the aforementioned franchises and features rightfully receive praise and constantly feature in horror movie discourse, there are underrated gems in the genre that match them in entertainment value, production quality, and most importantly, inducing fear. The reasons why these films did not take off vary from a mediocre critical reception to poor box office numbers to being overshadowed by more high-profile productions in the zeitgeist. But this does not take away from their ability to instill terror, shock, and disgust in even the most seasoned horror movie fan. Hopefully, this list will shine a much-deserved spotlight on these pictures and earn them new audiences who are seeking for something new from a decade long past. I'm Sean Ferrick for What Culture Horror, and here are 10 forgotten 80s horror movies you must watch. Number 10, The Burning. In the wake of the overwhelming success of the Friday the 13th franchise, many slashers emerged with the intent of capitalizing on the bloody exploits of Jason Voorhees and co. Among them is 1981's The Burning, a relatively small feature that, while bearing a notable similarity to its source of inspiration, still featured enough to stand out and gain a cult following over the years. Inspired by the urban legend of the Cropsey Maniac, the slasher follows camp caretaker Cropsey after he recovers from a prank played on him by a bunch of campers gone horribly wrong. Terribly disfigured, both physically and mentally, the caretaker turns into a serial killer thirsty for revenge against nearby campers. Upon its release, critics were not impressed by its similarities to the 1980 horror classic and denounced its gore that was part of a wider crackdown on video nasties during the decade. However, its reception has warmed significantly in recent years, with modern critics and audiences praising its set pieces and special effects work from the great Tom Savini. It is not a genre classic or a game changer, but it works as an appropriately spine-chilling campsite horror flick. Number 9, Dead and Buried. A zombie movie that chose to play things in low-key fashion, at least as far as horror is concerned, 1981's Dead and Buried is another motion picture that gained a favourable appraisal after its release, and with good reason. It effectively builds tone and suspense, features a foreboding atmosphere, and its effects work by the legendary Stan Winston are top-notch. The story sets its focus on Sheriff Dan Gillis, played by James Farentino, and a local coroner, William Dobbs, played by Jack Albertson, investigating a disturbing streak of killings in their town that have no motive or pattern beyond the brutal targeting of visitors. As the duo further unravel the mystery, Gillis realizes that his fellow townspeople are far from normal, and Dobbs is at the center of said phenomenon. Reminiscent of an old-school Twilight Zone episode, the Gary Sherman-helmed picture benefits from the aforementioned zombie effects work from Winston, as well as the late Albertson's game performance as the unsettling coroner. Dan O'Bannon's screenplay embraces surrealism, but ensures that the story and characters treat and deliver said surrealism with an odd sincerity rarely seen in such movies, helping it stand out from the pack as far as tone is concerned. Number 8, From Beyond. Helmed by Stuart Gordon and starring Jeffrey Combs, the director-actor duo who gave us Reanimator, From Beyond does not quite reach the dizzyingly gruesome heights of its fellow Lovecraft adaptation, but is still a visually striking, gruesome cinematic affair with a satirical bent that indicates it has a fair bit on its mind compared to most horror fare of its time. Fitting for a Lovecraftian adaptation by Gordon, the movie has scientist Dr. Edward Pretorius, played by Ted Sorrell, and his assistant Dr. Crawford Tillinghast, played by Combs, attempting to perceive higher levels of reality through their machine, the Resonator. Unsurprisingly, their ambitious experiment horrifyingly fails, and the two scientists end up locked in a battle of heightened consciousness, body horror, and eldritch heart terrors. While not as captivating as Reanimator, Gordon and his filmmaking team were able to put their stamp on Lovecraft's work, while thankfully avoiding the bigoted subtext found in many of the author's works. Thematically, it expertly explores mankind's hubris in dealing with the unknown and grotesque fascination with the human body. At the end of the day, despite not matching its predecessor, this is a heady, over-the-top piece of cinema that unashamedly embraces its kinks, freakish undertones, and imagery. Number 7, Next of Kin. A notable entry from the world of Ozploitation cinema, Aussie low-budget filmmaking, Tony Williams' 1982 mind-bending horror feature benefits strongly from solid lead performances and a blend of cinematic flavors such as Italian giallo and Australian action, as well as lush visuals that intentionally belie its bone-chilling story. Linda Linda Stevens, played by Jackie Caron, is the protagonist of this slow burn narrative, a woman who inherits her deceased mother's estate and its accompanying retirement home. Once she settles in, however, mysterious deaths begin to occur as Linda begins to learn more about her troubled family history, particularly her seemingly long-past aunt, Rita, played by Bernadette Gibson. The murder mysteries at the core of the story are fairly standard fare for the genre, but the execution is where the film shines. As mentioned before, the visuals are top-notch and they are ably supported by a creeping score and precise editing. However, the true stars of Williams' motion picture are its atmosphere and pacing, each working in tandem to build a palpable sense of suspense as Linda uncovers the dark truths about her new estate. Number 6. The Changeling. Haunted horror movies are easy to find in American horror, and while that is not quite the case in the Canadian side of things, this section of world cinema has one of the best entries in the subgenre in the form of The Changeling. Directed by Peter Medak and inspired by events that writer Russell Hunter claimed to experience in the 60s, this 1980 feature is a technically competent, well-acted affair with a somber yet chilling tone to boot. After experiencing great tragedy, famed composer John Russell, played by George C. Scott, moves from New York to Seattle, where he rents a long vacant mansion. Not long after occupying the structure, Russell begins to experience supernatural events tied to the death of a 6-year-old boy named Joseph Carmichael, played by Valdy Way. This is from nearly 7 decades prior to the story's events. This ghost story is capably anchored by Medak's direction and Scott's performance, who gives Russell an intriguing blend of somberness and desperation as he attempts to uncover the mystery behind Carmichael's gruesome demise. The sound design is also competently executed, immersing viewers into the haunting soundscape plaguing Russell, and actors Melvin Douglas and Trisha Van Dever round out the film's strengths, effortlessly stepping into their supporting roles as historian Claire Norman and devious senator and unwitting imposter Joseph Carmichael. Number 5. Stagefright. The realm of Italian cinema is renowned for its giallo productions, and Stagefright, dell'aria in Italian, is a seminal example of this. While its status as a giallo feature or a slasher flick is sometimes debated, there is no denying that this visually dazzling and claustrophobic project is impactful and unnerving in its own right. Filled to the brim with 80s excess and style, Michel Soavi's directorial effort also works due to having a decent amount of substance to hold its spectacle together. The giallo offering follows a theatre troupe rehearsing a play about a fictional killer known as the Night Owl dealing with a real-life murderer of their own, Irving Wallace, played by Clayne Parker or George Eastman, after the latter becomes obsessed with the play story. Once an apprentice of famed director Dario Argento, Soavi and writers Lou Cooper and Sheila Goldberg infuse this project with a gallows sense of humour and interesting commentary on the relentless pursuit of artistic perfection and the sensationalization of violence in art. Additionally, the imagery is impactful, and this is especially true for the Night Owl's eponymous mask, and the feature's giallo elements means the nail-biting set pieces are captured in surreal but somehow appealing colours and frames. Number 4. Butcher, Baker, Nightmare Maker. This interestingly titled horror thriller covers taboo, potentially sensitive material in an expert manner uncommon for its genre or even time, and still manages to offer viewers the requisite chills they have come to expect from horror pictures. William Asher's 1981 opus explores the devastating effects of an Oedipus complex, while crafting in Cheryl Lynch, played by Susan Tyrrell, a villain who is both captivating and repulsive in equal measure. Plagued by the above-mentioned antagonist is her nephew Billy Lynch, played by Jimmy McNichol, who lives with his controlling aunt after his parents died in a car accident when he was a baby. After Cheryl kills a shop technician out of spite, she inadvertently lands Billy in a complex and unnerving criminal investigation surrounding the murder and his own sexuality. An 80s horror movie exploring sexual identities outside the norm sounds like a potentially offensive affair, but to its credit, the slasher treats its gay characters with respect. This is particularly true for Tom Landers, played by Steve Easton, Billy's basketball coach, who is portrayed as a decent man caught up in the wake of Cheryl's grotesque behavior. Speaking of Cheryl, Tyrrell breathes deliciously over-the-top energy into her character, whose love for her nephew goes into uncomfortable territory. Her campy flair is only matched by Bo Svensson's Joe Carlson, who gives an unapologetically and fitting, deranged performance as the homophobic detective investigating the central murder. Number 3. Dolls. Another entry from Stuart Gordon, 1987's Dolls, does not hit the dizzying heights of his earlier work, but still functions as an entertaining and disconcerting reimagining of Hansel and Gretel, but with possessed puppets and dolls housing the souls of violent criminals. The movie kicks off with 6 individuals, a family of 3, 2 hikers and a businessman, seeking shelter in a mansion following a particularly intense thunderstorm. The mansion's owners, Gabriel and Hilary Hartwig, played by Guy Rolfe and Hilary Mason respectively, readily welcome the weary travelers hours, but they gradually learn that the elderly couple's toys are far more sinister and paranormal than one would expect. Admittedly, this feature lacks the polish of Reanimator or even From Beyond, but the puppetry and stop-motion work are solid and enhanced by its dark fantasy tone and sensibilities, which elevates it above standard haunted house fare. Beyond its gnarly and violent doll-fueled imagery, Dolls features solid performances from the cast, with Carolyn Purdy embodying spiteful rage as stepmother Rosemary Bauer and Ian Patrick Williams as neglectful father David Bauer being the standouts. Number 2. Night of the Creeps. Fred Decker's directorial debut, Night of the Creeps, is a lot of things. It's an alien invasion story, a slasher movie, zombie feature, comedy, and homage to B-movies all in one. While the latter aspect of the 1986 project explains its subgenre combination, it still stands out on its own to deliver a unique viewing experience worthy of its cult film status. Best friends Chris Romero, played by Jason Lively, and J.C. Hooper, played by Steve Marshall, are keen on joining their university's fraternity. This is mostly the case so that Chris can win over the affection of his crush Cynthia Cronenberg, played by Jill Whitlow. But in order to do this, the duo must steal a cadaver from the campus's medical center and then leave it at the door of their rival fraternity. Unsurprisingly, this fails once the friends realize the body they intend to steal is far from dead, and gory over-the-top events including aliens, body-possessing slugs, a murder mystery, and zombies ensue. For some, the genre melding might be a bit off-putting, and to be fair, the picture does not always nail its ambitious juggling act, but what it does is show its reverence for these genres in its execution, and said reverence goes a long way in upping its shock and entertainment factor. Number 1. Beyond Dream's Door. Written and directed by Jay Wolfel in yet another directorial debut, Beyond Dream's Door delivers a wonderfully surreal story that effortlessly captures the terrifying and confounding nature of nightmares. This 1989 indie horror movie was inspired by a 1983 short film of the same name and largely featured cast and crew from Ohio State University, where it was based. The low-budget but bizarrely charming cinematic effort follows Ben Dobbs, played by Nick Baldassare, a young college student who is plagued by vivid and unsettling nightmares filled with inexplicable imagery. He seeks the assistance of his psychology teacher, Professor Knox, and the latter's assistants. The team finds a connection between Ben's dreams and that of D.F. White, a man whose dreams were so intense that he slipped into a coma and died, and this discovery reveals the presence of a supernatural entity that stalks individuals' dreamscapes. The feature wears its Lovecraftian influence on its sleeves. The short film was inspired by Lovecraft's The Shadow Out of Time, and this can be seen in the monster that is terrifying Ben. It may not feature the polish of other films on this list, but it makes up for it with its dreamlike tone and meandering pace, which ends up being oddly fitting for such a story.